In Romans 1:18 to 4:25, Paul's going to talk about how God's righteousness, God's desire to have right relationship with humanity, is going to both judge and to save people. In many ways, what Paul does is he starts with the bad news first in order to get to the good news. Another way to think of this is that Paul wants to be honest with what the disease is, to diagnose properly what the illness is in order to bring the cure of Christ and salvation. So the bad news is that God's righteousness, God's desire to stand in right relationship with humanity, means that when humans sin, that God is going to judge the sinfulness of humankind. Paul starts by talking about how God has come to judge the worst of the worst, that God's judgment stands against the pagan world. In 1:18, Paul says, "For the wrath of God has been revealed against heaven, against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth." This is the same word for revelation, the apocalypto, as the revelation of God's righteousness. That the material world is peeled away, and what we see is the spiritual reality behind this present day and the present day circumstance. And the reality is that God's wrath has been revealed against the worst of worst, against pagans in the world. This is a not a wrath in terms of a wrath like what you see in Revelation, apocalyptic wrath, or the wrath that you see of Jesus' second return in Mark 13, where you see the bowls of wrath, and we think of things like fire and brimstone, we think of the lake of fire. The sort of wrath that Paul's talking about here, the wrath that's revealed, is not a wrath that's an active sort of wrath. Instead, what we discover is the sort of wrath that God has revealed here is a wrath of absence, of God dusting his hands of humanity and saying, you know what, fine, I leave you to your own devices, I leave you to your own sin. The wrath of God revealed is God leaving humanity to ourselves. And the reason why God has revealed his wrath against us is that it is a wrath against humanity because we are not in line with the truth of creation, that we have risen up against creation itself. That what was made known to us, it's plain to us, that creation gives a natural revelation of who God is, and yet we reject that revelation. We show impiety towards God of rejecting his truth, but not only impiety of a lack of love of God, but injustice in how we treat one another. That we exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling moral human beings, that we take up idolatry in this practice. And not only that we are revolting against God's truth as revealed in creation, but we're revolting against creation itself, the natural order of things. That in our pursuit of ourselves, that God is going to give us up for our lusts, our passions, our desires, to the impurity, the degrading of our bodies, because we exchange the truth of God for a lie. God gives up the pagan world to its own passion and desires and lets us reign and rule, lets those reign and rule inside us. For the Greeks and the Romans, the solution to overcoming one's passion and desire is the logos, is the reason overcoming passion and desire. But for Paul and for the Christian, it's Christ, and it's ultimately God's Spirit that dwells inside of us, that is meant to help us to overcome our evil desires and our evil passions. And yet, because of the sinfulness of humanity, God gives us over to those things. But it's also a giving over to humanity itself. What we discover in 1:28 is that not only do we not see fit to acknowledge God's truth in creation, we don't see fit to live according to God's order in the natural order of things, but we also don't see fit to acknowledge God in ourselves. And what happens is Paul is going to give a vice list, a list of the worst of the worst. This is saying, look, for example, these are what make evil people. So these are people that are full of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness, gossipers, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. They know God's decrees, and those who practice such things deserve to die. And yet not only do they do these evil things, but they applaud those who practice them. These are the people that reject God. This is a classic example of when we talk about, well, you know, I'm generally a good person. I'm not a murderer. I'm not someone who is a thief. I'm a good person. I'm not Adolf Hitler. I'm not Saddam Hussein. I'm generally a good people. God will think that I'm okay because I'm not that evil sort of person. Well, this is Paul's list of this sort of evil sort of people that are the worst of the worst, and God's judgment stands against them. And the reader of Romans is naturally supposed to agree and be nodding their heads with Paul further and further as he further describes the evil, rebellious nature of humankind. And at the end of the day, we're supposed to say, yes, God's wrath is revealed against the worst of the worst. We judge them, we condemn them, because God has judged and condemned. The tragedy is that God's wrath here is revealed is not this thunderbolt and lightning smite the evildoer. It's, you know what? I leave you to your own devices. I leave you to yourselves. You know what? You can just consume yourselves with the evil. And that's where God leaves us. And we're meant to be nodding our heads at this point in Paul's arguments. God's wrath is against the pagans. It's against the Gentile world. It's against the people who are godless, who have no love of God in their heart. But then Paul turns the knife. What we discover is that Paul is not only going to condemn the worst of the worst, but he's going to condemn the best of the best. The Jewish people are also condemned. And what we discover as we're nodding our heads is saying, yes, those pagans deserve their ends. They deserve their rewards. We have this line, Romans 2:1. Therefore, you who have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others in passing judgment on yourself, you condemn yourself. Ouch. So as we've been nodding our heads saying, yes, those vile, evil people, Paul says, you know what? There is no difference in sin. You, in the midst of judging that other person in your own self-righteousness, you have just turned and judged yourself. Proper judgment is not human judgment where we vie against one another, where we say, you know what, I'm just a little bit better than that other person, so God's going to accept me. Instead, what we discover in Paul is that proper judgment is not human judgment, it's the judgment of God. And proper judgment is so crucial, so key for Paul in Romans. We see this topic coming up again in Romans 14 and 15 with the weak and the strong, where there's going to be two different groups in the Roman congregation who are judging each other. And once again, Paul turns and says, you know what? Proper judgment is not humans judging humans. It's letting God, as the eternal judge, judge our hearts and convictions. Paul is going to object to humans who want to judge other humans for the purpose of human advancement, human privilege. And what he does is when he looks at Jewish people, he says, look, the things that you privilege yourself are the very things that condemn you by the sight of God. What we discover in Romans 2:12 is that Paul says, all those who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and those who have sinned under the law will be judged, ouch, by the law. God gives the Jewish people the best expression of his will, the law, and yet even those who have been given the law, they've been told the right from the wrong, and yet they don't have the power to do the right. And so they stand condemned equally as those like the pagan Gentiles who have been condemned apart from the law. Those who have seen God's character in the natural order of things as in creation, as in what Paul's talked about in chapter 1. Now he's saying, look, those who have the divine revelation, the special revelation, even those under law are condemned. Not only that, are those who have been given the law, have been given God's expression of his best expression of his will, are condemned, but any sort of favored status. So 2:17, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast on your relationship to God and know his will and determine what is best because you're instructed by the law, if you're sure that you're a guide to the blind, guide to those people in chapter 1, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector to the foolish, a teacher of children, having the law in the embodiment, God's perfection of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, won't you instruct yourself? That even this favored status of calling myself a child of God, calling myself a Jew, Paul says even that favored status does not get you ahead of the line in terms of the judgment of God. We all stand condemned. Not only that, but the sign of God's covenant with the Jewish people, the sign of his grace, the sign of his choice with them, circumcision, also does not count in the human desire to judge and rate one another to advance ourselves. Circumcision itself is of no value. 2:25. Circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. See, Paul believes that there is nothing within humanity that allows us to put ourselves slightly above another person, that at the end of the day we've all fallen short of the glory of God. Privilege, instead of being rooted in our status of in our own personal advancement, is not rooted in what we do. It's not what's been given to us. It is rooted in God and God alone. Paul says in 3:1, what advantage does a Jew have? You know, if the law's not an advantage, if their status isn't an advantage, if their circumcision isn't an advantage, what advantage do they have? Much in every way, 3:2. For in the first place, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Will their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? Meganoito, by no means. As though everyone is a liar, let God be proven true, so that you may be justified in your words and prevail in your judging. You see, the unfaithfulness of the Jewish people, the shortcoming of you and I, ultimately is what's going to prove the faithfulness, the trustworthiness of God, that in the midst of our own human failing, that God is a God who does not fail, and that our privilege is not rooted in our ability or the inability of others to get right inside of God. Instead, privilege is rooted in God and God alone. We cannot see ourselves as better than others. We cannot judge ourselves and vie for a better status, better position. Instead, what we need to do is we need to rely on the grace of God. So, the worst are condemned, and now the best are condemned. Paul wraps this all up in 3:10-20, where Paul is going to say, look, the worst of the worst and the best of the best have all been condemned by God. And Paul is going to give a daisy chain. The word is katena, a link words of citations from Scripture. In 3:10-18, Paul is going to give a whole series of quotes from the Old Testament that prove by the law that everyone is a sinner, both Jews and Gentiles, that the law itself is used not to give privilege to the Jewish people, not given privilege to the Gentiles, but instead what the law does is it reveals sin and condemns people. So Paul begins with none are righteous, no, not one, from Psalm 14:1-3. And he ends by saying there is no fear of God before their eyes, Psalm 3:6, and everything in between. That there's no one who has understanding, no one seeks God. All have turned aside. All have become worthless. There's no one who shows kindness, not even one. Throats are open graves. Tongues are used to deceive. Venom of vipers on their lips. Mouths are full of cursing. Feet are swift to judge. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace is not known. Paul lays it on hard that the law itself condemns and convicts of sin. Ultimately, Paul concludes, none are righteous, no, not one. 3:19 says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world may be accountable to God. No one is justified in God's sight. The law itself ultimately reveals sin. The law ultimately reveals that the judgment of God is against all of humankind, from the worst to the best. All have sinned and fall short of God. Glory of God. This is the bad news. This is the condition of the human heart. This is the status where people stand before God. God's right relationship to a sinful humanity is to stand in judgment over that humanity, to dust his hands and say, enough is enough, I leave you to your own devices. People stand under the wrath of God. This is the bad news of Romans 3, chapter 1, chapter 3. Paul has laid out hard what the bad news is, and thankfully Paul begins with the bad news in order to move to the good news, and we're going to see an incredible turn in 3:21.